So good evening and welcome to WildEarth Guardians' 12th Annual Howling Affair. I'm Lindsay Bidell, Major Gifts Officer at WildEarth Guardians, and I will be getting us started this evening. I am so excited to have everyone here tonight, some new folks, some longtime supporters, and some current and past board and staff members. Thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. First of all, I want to thank our generous title sponsor, DDC FPO Solutions, for their incredible and longtime support of Guardians, and specifically for supporting this year's Howling Affair. Thank you. The future of wolves in the American West hangs in the balance, but those of us that care about wolves aren't sitting idly by, which is why we are all here tonight. We have a great conversation planned between Guardians Executive Director, John Horning, Guardians Conservation Director, Sarah McMillan, and Rob Edward of the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project. The conversation will last 45 to 50 minutes, after which we hope to raise critical funds to support Guardians' wolf defense and coexistence work. So just a few reminders to make things go smoothly this evening. You were muted when you entered the event. We ask that you please stay muted in order to minimize background noise so that everyone can hear the person speaking. So thank you for that. You can also change your screen setting in order to always see the person speaking on the main screen by going to the top right corner of your screen and changing the view to speaker view. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar, you will see a chat box. And throughout the event, you can use that chat box to ask questions or make comments, which Guardian staff will be answering as we go along. You also have the ability within that to send a message to everyone in the group or to send a private message to a specific person by using the drop-down box. So just pay attention to that when you're sending. Lastly, technical challenges are unfortunately often a part of virtual events. So if you're having connection issues, please check your own internet first. And if you still can't figure it out, then you can contact Carol Norton at the number listed on the slide, and she can try to help you troubleshoot. Thank you, Carol. We are recording this event, so if there are major technical issues on your end, we can send you the recording afterwards. So fingers crossed that that doesn't happen. So far, so good. So now to kick us off, we are honored to have a videotape welcome from Congressman Joe Neguse of Colorado, a champion of gray wolves and imperiled wildlife, who has loudly called for a national commitment to address the current biodiversity crisis and is a partner on multiple Guardians projects. Launch that video next.
Technical difficulties. We can't hear Joe.
Everybody, Joe Neguse here, proud to represent Colorado in the United States Congress. It's so wonderful to be able to join you virtually with you today, and I'm so honored to be able to talk about biodiversity and the importance of a national biodiversity strategy for both Colorado and our nation. This is an issue of utmost importance to creating a world that ultimately is sustainable for future generations, and particularly in Colorado, it's one that hits home. Before I go too much farther, I want to say a big thank you to WildEarth Guardians for gathering everyone here today and for the valuable work that you all do. Your passion to protect the wild places of the West and stand up to opponents threatening our public lands is both inspiring and setting a necessary standard for how we should treasure our environment. We're so lucky to have organizers like you in our state. In Colorado, the health of our nature is inextricably linked, really, to the health of our communities, to the health of our economy, and the legacy that we leave for future generations. And what we know is that our lands are facing an unprecedented biodiversity crisis. It's been driven in large part by humans. We're losing too much land, too many species, too much beauty with each passing day. The scientific studies around this issue have made it very clear that as we damage ecosystems and exploit wildlife, we're also accelerating climate change. We're polluting our air and our water, problems that affect human health and disproportionately impact communities of color and indigenous people. I recently introduced a resolution which calls for a national strategy on biodiversity to guide our nation to a healthier and more harmonious future. This resolution would encourage government agencies to work together, pursue a full range of actions to tackle this issue from all sides. We need to think about biodiversity as a crisis of the environment, health, and security. In our resolution, we put forth guidelines, including climate adaptation strategies for biodiversity, a rapid building out of renewable energy, measures for equitable access to nature, and the importance of leading internationally in agreements like the Paris Climate Accord. We're also proud to be a part of a historic effort to conserve 30% of America's lands and waters by 2030. Now, this is a vision that myself and my colleagues helped call for in the last Congress, and now with President Biden leading the charge, we have a champion in the White House working to achieve this goal. This is something that, at the end of the day, we have to make sure is done. As we capture the power of natural solutions in tackling the climate crisis, and as we look to the future and the earth that our children will inherit. It's motivated individuals like you all that keep biodiversity in the national conversation. So if you have continued ideas for solutions, please don't hesitate to call my office. We're here to represent you and your values, and we couldn't do the work we do in Washington without your passion. So thank you again to WildEarth Guardians for having me. Thank you all for engaging with this issue and pursuing such important work. I look forward to continuing to work alongside all of you to protect our wild lands and ultimately the environment as a whole.
Thank you, Congressman Neguse. We are, I love his energy and his commitment to protecting biodiversity. And I just would say that all Americans, not just Coloradans, are lucky to have him as our advocate in Congress on public lands and endangered species and all biodiversity issues. He's a great champion to have. For those of you who I've not had the good fortune to meet, I am John Horning, the Executive Director of WildEarth Guardians. I love Guardians. I've devoted my life to Guardians, and I'm thankful that all of you have joined us here tonight. Though I'd prefer to be with everyone in person, one of the silver linings of the virtual experience is that we have people from all over the country with us this evening. So welcome again to all of you. We are going to start tonight with a story of wolves, and it comes from Sarah McMillan, who is WildEarth Guardians Conservation Director. And Sarah is joining us from her home in Missoula, Montana. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much, John. So it's a cold day in Yellowstone. You know when it's so cold that the snow squeaks? Well, it's about 30 degrees colder than that. My nose hairs freeze as I lift my face from the shelter of my jacket to scan with weary eyes the Lamar Valley. We're a group of 15 or so people standing and watching and waiting. And then finally we're rewarded with a wolf pack emerging from a thicket across the river, quite a ways away because the Lamar Valley, as many of you know, is massive. And that pack is several yearlings and an alpha pair. And the alpha pair is one black and one gray. And they start to distance themselves from the pack a little bit. And we see them begin courting behaviors. They mouth each other's muzzles, they romp and they bump against each other. And then they're walking together so close, it's as if they're tied at the hip. The group of humans is downright giddy to be seeing this display. And we feel a sense of community sharing the joy of witnessing their courtship. And the avid wolf watchers amongst us are very generous and share their scopes to those of us who have entirely inadequate binoculars. Word soon spreads in this group as we're watching this behavior that this is one of the most famous wolves, Spitfire, and her mate 925. And as we head back to our warm shelters at the end of this viewing, our hearts are filled with a shared experience. But when I look back on this, I realize that this was just a month or so before, first of all, Spitfire lost her mate, 925, to the rival Prospect Peak pack. And then, and this is a testament to her will to survive, she persuaded 4 members of that pack that killed her mate to join her in raising the pups sired by 925. And it just shows you how wolves will survive. They are doing everything they can if we can get out of their way. And then sadly, I will say that about 3 years after I saw this, Spitfire was legally killed just outside the park boundary. So that's sort of the joy and the wonder and the grief that comes with being a wolf watcher, I would say, and a wolf lover and advocate in this country.
Thank you, Sarah.
I think we're having more technical difficulties.
Can you play that again, Whitney, louder? If not, let me know.
No, it's as loud as it's going, the copy I have.
Okay. Well, you can hear those howls, even if faintly. Those weren't just any howls. Those were the howls of grief. As Sarah revealed at the end of her story, that was the Lamar Canyon Pack days after Spitfire was killed on the outskirts of Yellowstone. And as Sarah said, one of the challenges for those of us who love wolves is that when you embrace them as a totem, you have to embrace not only the wonder and awe of experiencing wolves, but you have to embrace the grief and outrage that also comes with being a wolf watcher, a wolf lover, and having wolves as totems. So our challenge tonight is to marry the grief of losing wolves and accepting the threats to wolves, not tolerating them, but accepting the reality of threats to wolves, and marrying that to our voices and fueling our outrage. But the outrage of an individual wolf killed pales in comparison to the outrage of what Idaho and Montana are doing and what they want to do to wolves. And so I wanted to have Sarah describe what is going on in Montana and Idaho so that we're clear on the nature of the threat to wolves. So could you speak to that, Sarah?
You betcha. There were several bills. My cat is trying to invade my habitat here. There were several bills that were passed in the legislative session this last winter and spring. They allow, a number of them involved different species, grizzly bears, black bears, but a lot of them focused specifically on wolves. And they allow neck snaring. A bill allowed night hunting with spotlights and night scopes. They allow baiting. They allow a person to kill an unlimited number of wolves with a single license. They created a system for what amounts to essentially a bounty for wolf trapping and hunting, which is similar to what's been happening in Idaho for several years. And they extended the season on wolves by an additional 30 days.
And what about the environment in Montana and what the legislature is doing there? How are we seeing that in terms of behavior on the ground?
So I think obviously these bills will allow for a lot more wolves to be killed legally. They're basically going to return us to the days when people were trying to exterminate all kinds of species that were deemed problematic, from wolves to bison to grizzly bears. But as insidious, more insidious than that, is that these new provisions really embolden those who have underlying hostilities. And while these bills were wending their way through the legislature with a ton of in-state and national attention, probably international as well, there were 2 young men who hired a helicopter and a pilot to take them shooting, and they poached 2 wolves without permission of the private landowner and from an aircraft, which is illegal in Montana. And they were each fined a few $100s, but they weren't prohibited from purchasing new hunting and trapping licenses. And the helicopter pilot wasn't investigated or fined at all. And similarly, our Governor Gianforte, not long before he signed these bills into law, himself trapped and shot a wolf, a collared wolf, one collared in Yellowstone, and he had not completed the necessary certification for a trapping license, and he was not fined, and he was allowed to keep that wolf. So the concern here is that this kind of change of the regulatory system really emboldens more illegal activity as well.
Yeah, it's really awful. I mean, it's just awful when leaders, in this case, a governor and others, are basically celebrated for killing wolves, and just seeing that culture emboldened and celebrated is really quite a sad thing for me to witness. As bad as things have gotten in Montana, it feels like things are going from bad to worse in Idaho.
Yeah.
What would you say about what's going on, what has happened recently in Idaho?
Well, I think I would give a little historical context, which is that Montana has been seen as being more moderate around its wolf management, and has been. And that's in part because we have had a Democratic governor who has vetoed a number of very similar or even identical bills in the past. We now have Governor Gianforte, who is not a Democrat and did not veto these bills. So he is working to join Idaho in its position, I would say ranking as like #1 in hostility towards wolves. So we have a history of being less hostile in Montana. I say we, I do take great pride in being a Montanan. And Idaho is going to maintain its #1 seat. They passed a new law that allows up to 90% of the wolves in the state to be killed. And it authorizes nearly unrestricted methods, including year-round killing, aerial gunning, which is illegal in Montana, baiting, hunting from snowmobiles and ATVs, and the use of night vision goggles as well. So the thing that I think is really important to know is that nearly 600 wolves were killed in Idaho in last year in 2020, basically. And they don't really need to increase the ways to kill wolves because they're already very successful at it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just horrible. And I remember you saying that that the Idaho Fish and Game Department, which is really no friend of Guardians, even opposed this bill. So this is an example of how hyper politicized wolves have become. And it feels like, though they've always been a pawn in the culture wars in our country, they've become a more of a figure piece in the culture wars in our country. And it saddens and outrages me that that's the case. So
I have one little piece of data that I think is pretty interesting. Only just over 100 sheep and cattle were killed by wolves last year in Idaho. And something like 40,000 were lost to non-predator factors. So 102 sheep and cows were killed by wolves. 600 wolves were killed in Idaho in that same time period. So the argument that so many sheep and cows are being killed by wolves is really not a reality. Similar to the ignoring of the science by the Idaho Fish and Wildlife Agency, they're also ignoring the truth around the threats to livestock.
Yeah. Well, it's a pretty dark chapter, and it's in a dark place right now. And we wanted to shift from a place of darkness to a place of light and hope. And with that in mind, we wanted to move southward on the political and geographic landscape to Colorado. And with me now will be Rob Edward. Rob is a longtime wolf advocate, former Guardian staffer, was the president of the Rocky Mountain Wolf Action Fund, which ran the campaign to ultimately bring wolves back to Colorado. And he's now a volunteer for the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, which is continuing that work of engagement with the State Wildlife Agency. So welcome, Rob. Good to have you.
Good to be here, John. Thanks.
Yeah. So I thought we'd take the conversation in three parts, very basically, from what happened to where are we now to where do we go from here. So why don't we start with what happened in Colorado that we're all feeling so hopeful and proud about?
Well, Colorado ultimately took the advice of science over fear and the livestock industry and elected to restore wolves after they'd been wiped out over 80 years ago at the behest of the livestock industry. The war that is happening in Idaho and Montana and Wyoming right now on wolves is the modern day replication of that genocidal fever that happened at the beginning of the 1900s, late 1800s. And so while we're sad to see what's going on there, while the actions of those who would kill wolves in the ways that Sarah described would otherwise be called terrorists if their targets were humans. Here in Colorado, we've chosen to take a different path. And we believe that ultimately we can do things differently. We can bring wolves back and we can have an ongoing, hard, long, decades-long conversation with folks who are concerned about wolves being present on the landscape and ultimately have wolves succeed.
So tell us more, just for those of the audience members that don't know, just a little bit more about what happened in November of last year to set the stage for the challenge in this moment, so what happened and how did that come about, and what did it require to win?
Well, it was a classic ballot initiative campaign. We started gathering signatures in the summer of 2019 with the help of a cadre of volunteers and a lot of paid signature gatherers, because there's simply no way you can gather that many signatures, several 100,000 signatures in order to qualify for the ballot in a 6-month window without paid staff. So we raised the money to get those signatures gathered, north of $1 million, and ultimately qualified for the ballot. The Secretary of State affirmed that in early January 2020. As news was filtering out from Wuhan, China, that life is about to change for all of us dramatically. We couldn't choose what else happened in the world, but we're going to run a ballot initiative campaign during a pandemic. And we did it almost all virtually. We were outspent in the last 6 weeks of the campaign 3-1 by the livestock industry and the organized hunting lobby. And we still won.
It's incredible. When I reflect on what you and the broad coalition of groups were able to accomplish in Colorado, to me, I have two take homes. One is it's a reflection of citizen democracy and democracy at its best, but it's also an indication of the powerfully entrenched state wildlife agencies and the commissions that govern them that are so resistant to reflecting the will of the people.
Great.
So
we really shouldn't have had to do this. When I was still on staff with WildEarth Guardians, I was trying to get the state agency to do the right thing. And got them to the point of actually impaneling a wolf advisory group to look at the possibility of restoring wolves. They set that aside right from the beginning and said, let's just talk about if wolves wander in on their own. So it was very clear that, you know, despite all efforts, it was going to take the citizens telling the state agency it's time to undo a decades-old wrong.
Yep. And of course, that's what it takes sometimes. Our elected officials are imperfect beings and too often lag where the social consensus is. So give us a sense of where we are now in this moment and where we are now in this campaign. We won. The state has a mandate. Where do we go from here?
Well, it's actually a fairly momentous day if you're somebody who works for the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Department, because today they announced the composition of both their technical working group and their stakeholder advisory group, which will have some input into the planning process. But let's be clear, Proposition 114, the ballot initiative that we won in November 2020, is now law, and it tells the state wildlife management agency wolves must be reintroduced by December 31st, 2023. You must have at least put one set of notable wolves on the ground by that time. And implied in that is that you need to have a plan to do that. So now we're in the planning phase. So those groups that were just impaneled will have some input, but ultimately they can't come back with recommendations that would go against that law. So the die is cast, the clock is ticking, and the people who are at the table on those working groups have to work under that reality. And from the conservation side, all of the conservationists who are going to be part of this process, I'm not one of them, I didn't even apply. I was part of that first one back in 2006. I am confident we'll continue to insist that everything that is said and claimed be held up to the mirror of peer-reviewed science, or at least good data, verifiable data. For example, the Time Warn saw that wolves are going to wipe out the elk. What have we seen in Idaho and Montana and Wyoming? We have more elk on the ground now than when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Sorry, move on.
Mm-hmm.
And my conservation colleagues are very well versed in pushing back against that.
That's great to hear that today was a momentous day. I didn't realize that. So it's good to know that the process is continuing. It's less than 20 months. What do you think it's going to take? What's it going to take for the state? I know they are bound by law, and we also know that there are still powerful forces, not only within Colorado Parks and Wildlife, but also within the state of Colorado, who would love to slow things down and drag out the timeline. What's it going to take to ensure that the state delivers on that legal obligation to have wolves on the ground in less than 20 months?
Citizen vigilance. 2 words.
Say more.
Citizen vigilance. People who are plugged into WildEarth Guardians and all of our other conservation NGO colleagues need to make their voice heard, especially if they live in Colorado. Pay attention to the Parks and Wildlife Department's website about upcoming public comment periods. Make your voice heard. Ask questions of people who know something about wolves from Guardians or elsewhere, and get the facts. Go to Colorado State University's People and Predator series website and get the fact sheets that back up the science behind why wolves are necessary for wild landscapes and not the end of the world for.
Uh-oh. Did we lose Rob there, frozen in a moment in time? You're back. We lost you for 5 seconds there, Rob.
Okay. You got me now?
We got you now.
Okay.
So
it's people being plugged in over the long haul. I've been doing this since 1994. I have my good days and my bad days, but I never really step away from it completely. So stay involved and make sure that your decision makers know that you're watching. In Colorado, it's a very hopeful situation, though, because we know, number one, we have a governor who's completely supportive of this process. And we have a state legislature who've demonstrated just this session that they're supportive of this process, too. They just passed a funding measure that put 1.1 or 1.2 million dollars on the table for wolf recovery.
excellent. That's great to hear that at least the legislature is doing its part to reflect the will of the people and to provide the financial capital to support the agency in its job.
Yep.
So, well, thank you for your persistence and resilience and vigilance all these years. And to all of the people on the call, know that we will do our part here at Guardians to continue to apply pressure in Colorado on the state agency to deliver on the mandate that the people of Colorado set for the agency. So we want to spend our next 15 minutes talking about really what is, I think, the next great chapter in the story of wolves in our country, and especially in the American West, which is building a culture of coexistence and talking about the work of Guardians to build that culture of coexistence. And I thought we'd start briefly just with reflecting on coexistence, because we come, I think all of us, or each of us here, Sarah and Rob and I, with a little baggage about the word coexistence, because in the past, coexistence has largely meant a dead wolf or a dead carnivore at the end of some process that was either a hollow one, or at best, they checked the box in the process. So I just wonder if both of you could reflect briefly about what you think it means to build a culture of coexistence. It's a big question, but what do you think it means to build a culture of coexistence in the American West?
Sarah, do you want to go first?
You go.
Okay. To my mind, it requires, first of all, something really important from the wolf huggers, and that is humility, the ability to set aside years, decades of animus towards the other side, understanding that they may not do the same, and to engage with an open heart and open ears, and to really truly give some time for the people who are arguing against you face to face to voice their worldview, their concerns, etc. And then to pivot immediately to what we know from the data, what we know from 25 plus years of wolves being on the ground in the Northern Rocky Mountains and in the Great Lakes states as well. What we know from that versus what they just told us their concerns are. And then move on to examples of the what they might not believe in even is possible. That you can have ranchers, for example, have wolves on their private land that they believe, the ranchers believe they are the stewards of, that they need to keep the wolves apart from the cows, and calves, and that is part of,
shoes, 2 sizes larger than
Part of their-
Someone mute themselves.
Barbara Lawson, could you mute?
Moderator should be able to do that.
We're good.
Okay, so ultimately that's the key, is we've got to listen, but then we have to go back to what we know from science and from a growing body of on the ground evidence that it is possible to coexist with wolves and have what some would call a working landscape.
Yeah.
We can't marry getting cows and sheep off the land to wolves. Wolves are their own deal. We can all have our own view of how to deal with the West as it evolves as a land management reality, but wolves and livestock production are not necessarily oil and water.
Yep. Thank you, Rob. What about you, Sarah? Briefly.
Yeah, I think a lot about the fact that current research and studies of sort of what society wants and believes in increasingly shows this interest in mutualism and not a utilitarian approach to nature. And so I believe that as a society, we are trending more in that direction, and that I'm thinking primarily about carnivores and livestock interaction on public lands. And I believe that our public land management agencies need to start shifting how they do business, and they have a responsibility to the wildlife that live on those lands. And I feel like coexistence should truly be where all are allowed to be, not all in the same place. So I don't think that cattle or baby sheep should be put out right next door to a grizzly den, which happens in some places, right? That's all in the same place is not the right thing, but there is enough space that we can say this is not a place for grazing, or if you're going to graze here, you don't get to kill wildlife. You have to take all of the other measures that are going to prevent conflict. So.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you both. We want to talk now about when we were preparing for this, we thought, we really need a national coexistence platform. So we're going to give you Guardians' version of a national coexistence platform through the lens of what we are doing day in and day out through the work at Guardians. And forgive me, it's a little chitsy, but I'm going to talk about it in 5 parts. It's react, restore, remove, reform, and reintroduce. And so we're going to react to what's happening in Idaho and Montana. We're going to restore Endangered Species Act protections. We're going to remove the cruel tools of the institutions that are hostile to wolves. We're going to reform the system and culture of ranching and livestock production in the West. And we're going to play our role in reintroducing wolves in Colorado. So let's start with the react to what's happening in Idaho and Montana. And Sarah, I know we haven't, we don't have all of the details spelled out, but speak to what you can about what we're thinking about how to engage with what is happening in both of those states.
Yeah, so I'll say that we have been in some coalitions, discussions of different approaches. Some organizations have already started taking certain approaches, and we're still really trying to nail down what we think the most strategic approach is. And I really am not ready to disclose the details, but I will say that we're working with a couple of longtime partners of ours in developing a litigation potential, a policy approach. So trying to figure out if it's going to be wholly on the federal side or also approaching it at the state level as well. So I'm being very vague because we haven't yet figured it all out, and I don't want to divulge any secrets.
Sure. And one thing that I would say is that as much as, of course, Idaho and Montana and the citizens of those states and the legislatures of those states and the state wildlife agencies can make choices that are their own choices, there are millions, if not tens of millions of acres of public lands in those states. And those are the lands of all the people of America, and those federal agencies have obligations, sort of trust obligations, to protect wildlife. And we have for years wanted to push federal agencies to embrace those mandates and that kind of ethical duty. And so this may be the opportune moment for us to push on that legal and ethical platform. So let's go now to the next component of our vision and work, which is restoring Endangered Species Act protections for wolves. What are we doing there, Sarah? You're muted.
There we go. As many of you know, the ESA protections for wolves in the past were quite complicated. There were places that were delisted by legislative rider, and that was Montana, Idaho, Eastern Washington, Oregon, and a little piece of Utah. And then most recently in 2020, all of the lower 48 were delisted by a decision from the Trump administration Fish and Wildlife Service. So we are in litigation in a coalition, a small coalition, working to get that delisting reversed. And one person had asked in the chat, well, what about Colorado wolves? Well, there are no wolves in the United States are protected. That's not true. Mexican wolves are protected. They retain their protection, but there are no wolves other than Mexican wolves that are protected by the federal ESA right now. And so this litigation is challenging the decision to delist those populations other than the Montana, Idaho, Northern Rockies population. And our hope is that we will prevail and get protections, which will then create a different situation for Colorado wolves being reintroduced, and will ensure that wolves, as they disperse from those larger populations in Montana and Idaho into other places, will be protected as well. So, yeah.
And what's your sense of when we might get a decision? I know that's there's plenty of uncertainties, but would you imagine that decision would come down this year?
Well, I'm trying to think what I can say.
Maybe.
As you might imagine, the Biden administration is quite different in its approach from the Trump administration. And so there are conversations happening about whether that litigation will continue. So I don't know exactly when something might happen, but there are discussions that will mean maybe we can come to an agreement about how to resolve it without having to continue with the litigation through the court system.
Yep. I'd like to think there's reason for hopefulness there. So let's all stay tuned to that. So I'm going to shift to the next component of this national coexistence platform, which is removing the cruel tools that the institutions like the Federal Animal Damage Control Agency have used. And I just want to touch on two very brief things. One is this year in New Mexico, after working for more than a decade, we, along with a coalition of groups, were able to convince the New Mexico legislature to ban traps, snares, and poisons. And so that makes New Mexico's public lands, including state school trust lands and other public lands, in addition to our national forests and BLM lands, much more safe for wolves and other native carnivores and other wildlife, and obviously for people's companion animals as well. So that was a victory that required years and years of persistence, and feel just really good about having won that. And complementing that legislative approach at the state level, we've been engaged for the last 8 years, if not more than that, in reforming, definitely more than that, but 8 years through the courts in reforming the Federal Animal Damage Control Agency, which uses these tools to so-called manage wildlife. And I was tallying up all the figures over the last 7 lawsuits. The most recent that we settled in New Mexico, I think, was our 8th. And in total, we've protected more than 37 million acres of public lands. Not all of these protections are permanent, for sure. So that's one of the concerns. But each of these settlements give us an opportunity to provide interim protections and to pressure the agency to reform their practices through the National Environmental Policy Act and the additional scrutiny and analysis that the agencies need to go through as a result of these settlements. Sarah, did you want to add anything there briefly?
I guess I'd just say that while we've had all these settlements, litigation, and then settlements with wildlife services, or animal damage control, as John likes to call them, because that used to be their name before they changed their name to confuse everybody about their real purpose. In addition to all of that, we're also really thinking about, again, the land management agencies and what's their role and what's their responsibility. And one of the things, John and I were talking about this recently, and just that they have a responsibility to, if they authorize grazing, they have to deal with the consequences, and instead of just sort of throwing their hands in the air and saying, oh, no, that's not what we do. And so anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent, but we're looking at the systems that allow so much of the cruel treatment of animals, of wildlife, and the killing of wildlife.
That's a perfect segue to the next cornerstone of our coexistence platform, which is reforming the system and culture of ranching and livestock production in the American West. And for those of you who know Guardians well, you know that we have been working on a collaborative approach with livestock producers on public lands to allow for a voluntary mechanism in which we or other third parties would pay ranchers to relinquish their grazing permits in areas of high conflict, whether it's for concerns about clean water or concerns about wolves, grizzly bears, or other native carnivores. And we're very excited and hopeful that in the coming weeks, we will have federal legislation that would make those transactions permanent, so that the Forest Service and the BLM could not undo the decisions and the transactions that retire those grazing permits. So that's a critical component of reforming the system and culture of ranching and livestock production in the West. And Sarah, could you speak just a little bit more about getting the Forest Service to adopt a coexistence mandate, perhaps touching on the Colville as an example of working through the courts to confront the livestock industry as well?
Yeah, so on the Colville National Forest, there is a single rancher who is responsible for, I'm afraid I don't know the numbers, but multiple packs being removed, which means being killed. And that's because that rancher is unwilling to take necessary measures to prevent conflict, and so then calls in an agency to fix the problem. It is not Wildlife Services that's coming in to fix the problem. It's been the state agency doing it. And so we challenged the Forest Service's failure to require any conditions on grazing permits, to failure to ensure the safety of the wildlife that call the Colville National Forest home. So we're in process. There was just Jennifer, actually just last week, I believe it was, maybe the week before, had an oral argument in that case, and we're moving forward on that, trying to get the Forest Service to take responsibility for what it allows, for the consequences of what it allows to happen on the national forest it manages.
Great, thank you for that update. I think I really enjoy this dual approach that Guardians has, where we're in the courts, kind of bare knuckled, fighting the worst of the public lands ranchers who are totally intolerant and hostile to wolves. And then we're working with public lands ranchers who are between a rock and a hard place and looking to transition out of the industry and building the political will and popular support for that vision as well. So stay tuned on both of those. Hopefully we'll win that Colville lawsuit and we'll have federal legislation allowing for permits to be retired here, introduced in the coming weeks. I want to, before I get to my close, just ask both you and Rob to speak to Colorado. We know that if the state does its job in less than 20 months, excuse me, we hope that it were 20 minutes, if only. But in less than 20 months, the state will have put wolves on the ground. And how can we better prepare the Colorado social landscape for wolves, both? So could each of you briefly speak to that? Rob, you want to go first?
Sure. We need to work with our coalitional partners to have as many volunteers out on the ground for as many good weather and bad weather days as possible, talking with people, especially people who live where wolves are going to set up shop, which is Western Colorado, and help them understand what it means to have wolves as part of the landscape again, what it doesn't mean, in other words, myth busting, and opening up that dialogue that I talked about earlier, listening, but then coming back with the science. And that's going to be something that we're going to have to do forever. We just have to accept that until some really huge paradigm shift happens, there's going to be a powerful subset of our population that is going to continue to push back against wolves and grizzly bears and anything that they see as either an impediment to their making money or as representing a worldview that they don't like. And unfortunately, wolves are a surrogate for that as well.
Thank you for that, Rob. Persistence.
Yep.
Sarah.
I think in addition, I absolutely agree, Rob. And in addition to that, we also are going to need to put, systems in place, both for the state, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, to manage wolves, and for the federal public land management agencies as well, to change the way they manage activities on the lands in order to truly prevent conflict and ensure that the wolves that are reintroduced aren't immediately put into conflict situations. So I think we'll be doing some of what Rob talked about, and we're also going to be doing the sort of policy advocacy side of things as well.
Great. Well, I feel like there's so much work to be done and so much work that is being done to create a safer place for wolves on so many landscapes in the West by so many people who care deeply. So I want to thank you, Sarah and Rob, for sharing your stories and your passion and your wisdom for wolves. I want to close where Sarah began and where we just were, which is with the wolves of Yellowstone and the future wolves that will transform Colorado's landscapes. 26 years ago, our nation embraced a new paradigm when we chose to reintroduce wolves to Yellowstone. Since then, pioneering wolves have reclaimed territory from Greater Yellowstone to Oregon, Washington, and California. Mexican wolves have likewise been restored to the Southwest. And just today, I heard a story of a Mexican wolf that's been living in northwestern New Mexico, pushing the frontier of habitat that Mexican wolves claim as their own. So it's exciting what's happening with wolves across the West in many, many respects. Over the last 3 decades, we've learned so much about the critical role of wolves, especially in their ecological role in transforming landscapes. We can also learn something else from wolves. And it's that there's strength in numbers. When I look out at the people gathered here tonight, I'm heartened and grateful by your commitment to protect wolves and to protect the natural world. If the story of wolves from 1995 to this moment is primarily, or has been primarily, about reintroduction and reclaiming historic ground, then the story for the next 30 years of the wolf-human drama, I believe, is all about coexistence, transforming institutions, cultures, and people, and of course, laws and regulations to make our landscapes more welcoming and safe for wolves. And that's not just the external landscape, but the internal landscape of humanity as well. Because as much as it's key to find space on the ground, we also have to find space in our hearts, individually and collectively, for wolves. This is the work of Guardians. Whether it's working with ranchers to retire grazing allotments and with Congress to change the law to allow for those transactions to be permanent, or restoring Endangered Species Act protections for wolves, or confronting those who demonize wolves, or transforming the culture of the federal animal damage control agency to lay down their traps, their snares, and their poisons, and take up the tools of coexistence. These are all vital aspects of Guardian's vision for coexistence. It's not going to be easy. There will be moments, and we are perhaps in one now in some respects, when the darkness will cast its long shadow on the light within us and the light that we project in the world. And my feeling is those are moments when we just have to redouble our commitment to wolves. So I just know that with persistence, resistance, that we'll eventually see wolves in every nook and cranny of habitat where they can thrive. And that we also want people and communities to celebrate these magnificent animals and hopefully to tell their stories of coexistence so that we can create this new chapter in the wolf-human drama. So thank you all, and I'm going to hand it off to Kevin Gaither-Banchoff and Carol Norton.
Good evening. I'm Kevin Gaither-Banchoff, Guardians Development Director. And I want to start by saying thank you, John, Sarah, and Rob, for your work and your inspiration and an informative program tonight. And thank you, all of you that chose to be here tonight. Everybody, I hope you got inspired and jazzed up, because we are going to start my favorite part of every single event that I do. And this is the part where we ask you to make a financial contribution to support the things we just talked about. And as a way to start, to remind you of the stakes before we get going, I want to show you a short video. Wolves need wolf guardians. And this month, we want to raise at least $50,000 to help fund our expanding wolf work. And in just a minute, we're going to do a fund a need paddle raise to jumpstart this campaign tonight. The way this works is we're going to say a gift amount starting at $10,000, and then we will work our way down in increments to $100. When I say an amount that inspires you tonight, you have a chance to indicate that you want to make a gift at that level. And we have 3 ways to do this. What are they, Carol?
Yeah, hi, I'm Carol Norton, Associate Director at WildEarth Guardians. And as Kevin mentioned, when we say giving level, that matches your inspiration tonight, there are 3 ways to give. First, you can go into the chat and pledge, and you can see this on the slide as well. You can go into the chat and pledge your gift publicly there, inspiring others to join you. Please put your name and pledge amount in the chat box when we get to the right level for you, as this will help us keep an accurate count. Second, you can go into the chat box by using the drop down. You can send the pledge to me or Kevin privately. When you click on the drop down arrow next to our names will next to the names, our names will be on the list, and this will let you remain anonymous. And then finally, you can go to our website anytime. Caitlin's going to drop that link in the chat right now, and just give immediately. If you give through the chat box, we'll work with you offline in the coming days and weeks to fulfill your pledge. So you may want to do that with stock or, a variety of different ways. That all works. It works to be a guardian. Kevin.
Excellent. Thank you, Carol. As I said earlier, we've set a goal of raising $50,000 for wolves. Attacks on wolves, endangered species, other native carnivores, and our bedrock environmental laws have seldom been greater. But Guardians is made for these times. That's why I work here, and I'm guessing that's why you're here tonight. So what I want to do right now is raise some money. Wolves in the wild need us. So I'm going to start bigger than I thought, but what the heck? Is there anyone here tonight that is inspired to cover our entire fundraising goal in one fell swoop? Is there anyone that wishes to give $50,000? Well, you always got to try. You never know when someone's really going to get inspired. All right, let's move a little lower. So let's move a little lower to $10,000. If you are between $50,000 and $10,000, that would be just as lovely as well. A gift of $10,000 could help us end the use of brutal killing traps, snares, and poisons on public lands by helping our contractors. What?
Hello. Goldilocks says, that bowl is too big. That bowl is too small. I'm going to go in between.
What do you got?
I'm a board member at Guardians, and I love participating in the Give-a-thon. I'm going to pledge 20,000.
Woo!
And
yeah.
It's the beginning of the year. It's the beginning of the year. So stay tuned. But this is important. This is important. Wolves at the Gila, wolves at the northern part of the nation. We've got to get this together.
Thank you, Anne.
20. So I'm hoping everybody else will think big and stretch, because this is important. We've got to keep the megafauna going. It's important.
Thank you, Anne. Is there anyone who would like to join Anne in some capacity at the $10,000 or the $20,000 level? I would like to, I can't. and at this point, I will hand it over to Carol.
We love you, Anne. Thank you. Our board members, we have a 100% giving board. And we're really grateful and proud of them. Is there anyone in the room who would like to give at the $5,000 level? $5,000 is an interesting amount to us because it fully funds a trip to DC. And for those of you who remember pre-COVID, we did used to go to DC. And in fact, our trips to DC have improved the plight of wolves in the Gila with increased buyout support. And also it gives us the opportunity to be seen and heard. Is there anyone in the room the virtual room, who would like to give at the $5,000 level? Kevin, what's next?
Excellent. Is there a gift, an investment of $2,500? What would that do for Guardians? A gift at that size could help us complete a mapping project. For example, mapping how a gray wolf in the Northern Rockies might make its way south to Yellowstone, or a Mexican wolf might migrate north from the Gila to Utah or Colorado, or we might even map all the oil and gas hotspots across the West to help with that work. Is there anyone here tonight who would like to invest $2,500? Bill Syme, thank you very much. Is there anyone who would like to join Bill this evening?
Well, Kevin, I'm already getting the 1,000 gifts coming in. Feel free to do that publicly or privately. Both are great. We really appreciate it. Is there anyone who would like to invest at the $1,000 level? $1,000 covers the filing fees for a key lawsuit. So we've talked tonight about challenging the wolf killing bills passed in Idaho and Wyoming. And that would be an example of where $1,000 would get us into court. $1,000.
We have $1,500 from Doyle McClure.
Thank you, Doyle.
Thank you, Doyle.
Thank you. We have a nice start on our $50,000 goal for this month. All right, I am going to move us on. Thinking about $500, which is down actually more around my realm. It's what I give every year in monthly installments to Guardians. These gifts can help cover the costs of a public rally calling for clean air, or a public hearing calling for continued endangered species protections for the gray wolf or the grizzly bear or other imperiled species. Is there anyone who would like to join me as a $500 donor?
Kevin mentioned ESA or imperiled species, and 3 weeks ago, our new ESA advocate, Joe Bushyhead, started at WildEarth Guardians. He's very good at his job, not cheap. Love him.
I think, yes, you're up, Carol.
Great. Okay, we're down to 250. Gifts of all sizes are critical. For those of you who've been to these events before, you know that. We love them. We love all of them. And it's important. Every gift is important to ensuring our long-term success. Is there anyone who would like to invest $250 tonight? $250 is good. Will help us do things like print and distribute any one of our dozens of incredible reports. Check the website to people who really need to see it. A lot of comments tonight about education in the chat. Education starts with policymakers. We use these reports all the time to help them understand and help their staff understand exactly what is at stake today. I want to say that I had $1,000. Was my level. Thank you. I'm Jerry and Roberta Syme. Back to 250. Okay, Kevin.
Yes, thank you, everyone. So my next question would be, or is $100 your number? You know, $100 gifts can be added together to fund any of the things we've already spoken tonight. Is there anyone who would join $100?
Sarah, 250. Go, girl.
Thank you, Sarah. And maybe we didn't call your gift tonight. David Lynn at $1,000. Thank you, David. Thank you, David. So maybe we didn't call your number tonight. If you have another size gift you'd like to make tonight, you can either tell us in the chat or you can go on the website and make it there. And we definitely had several anonymous gifts come through. I'm humbled. Thank you for your support tonight. We'll give you a total in a few minutes. You're also generous. So we'll announce a rough total. We'll send follow-up note out to attendees, both on how we did tonight and follow our month-long campaign progress as we work to raise this money. And those of you who pledged, we'll follow up with you to help you make your gift. Carol?
Gifts are still coming in. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. Deborah Taylor's adding another $50 to her gift from this morning. Appreciate it. I want everyone to prepare. We're going to do a howl here in a moment. Before we do that, I just want to thank you all for being here. This is our 12th annual Howling Affair. We're really looking forward to getting back into real life, seeing you all in person. Appreciate you taking your evening tonight to be with us. And many of you spend all day on a screen, so more of that. I enjoyed Rob, John, Sarah, talking with all of you. Thank you for your chats. Really, really appreciate it. And remember, we're going to do the howl. So now everybody needs to unmute. I don't know if the host can unmute all, but if you can, that would be great, because it looks kind of funny if you howl with when you're, without any noise. And here we go for the wolves. We will have a total number here in a few moments if you want to hang out. Kevin and a number of the other staff, including me, will be here for the next few moments, answering questions, talking with folks. You're welcome to stay off mute. Thank you all. We really, really appreciate your time, and we'll see you out in the wild.
Yes, Caitlin, do we have a rough total?
I texted it to you, but it's probably getting to you slowly. So the total that we have is $40,850.
Awesome.
Wow.
So that's a great start.
$100 more.
All right, well.
No, 900.
Thank you, everybody. And you know what, given tonight was kind of the Kickstarter, I'm probably going to raise the goal this month, but that's an issue for another day. Thank you, everyone, for giving us the jump start.
Thank you, everyone.